Welcome back to Social Studies 20-1. This is Lesson 5, World War I. And our first outcome we're looking at today, we want you to understand the nature of World War I. Included under that umbrella, we want you to understand it is a world war, it's a war of attrition, and that it involved trench warfare. Second to that, we want you to understand the nature of it by looking at the costs associated with it. And here we will get started. So please take note of how World War I was a world war because it was fought in many different theaters. You can have a war that is very localized, that may have high casualties. That's not what defines it as a world war. It's not the casualty number. It's the number of theaters in which the war is contested. So World War I will have events in Europe primarily, in the Near East, in Asia, in what was the Ottoman Empire. There'll be some limited events in Africa, in the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans, more so in the Atlantic. There'll be some off the coast of North America and South America as well. There'll be some events in Southeast Asia, although again limited in scope. World War II will have those theaters as well, but more active theaters. Primarily, World War I will be a European war, but we'll have other events happening in these other theaters. So why is it a world war? Because it's happening in many theaters. What is a theater? It's a region based on continent or based on an ocean where it's being contested. So first thing to note, World War I was a world war. Now, they didn't call it World War I, obviously, at the time. They didn't know there was going to be a two. They called it the Great War. Now, the second point we'd like to talk about is this was a war of attrition. Now, when I think about a war of attrition, I think of a 7-game series in sports where sometimes it's about which team can still, ice a complete hockey team for Game 7. Which team has the energy to win Game 7? So attrition means you're trying to wear the enemy down to the point of collapse through continuous loss in terms of World War I personnel and material. The war will usually be won by one side with greater resources. So there's an economic component of winning a war of attrition because you need to be able to fuel your war. There's also an issue with supply lines. How are we going to continue to supply our troops? And lastly, another nuance or a way to describe the nature of World War I is it is a trench war. So why was it a trench war? Why did they end up in trenches? It wasn't like it was a master plan in August of 1914 for both sides to wind up in trenches. It's just the way it ended up resulting. So war is going to break out, and the Germans realize that they're going to face two mighty opponents on either side. They have the French to their west, the Russians to their east, and they want to avoid a two-front war. So they've had in place for decades something called the Schieffelin Plan. And the Schieffelin Plan is we need to quickly knock out our western foe, France, and then turn our might upon our eastern foe, Russia. And we're going to focus on France first because they will be able to mobilize more quickly than Russia. So the Schieffelin Plan is this idea of trying to quickly knock out the French and then turn upon the Russians. And in order to do so, in order to achieve that quick victory, they're going to need to be able to maneuver around the main French lines. So instead of attacking from Germany into France at the heart of the French defensive lines, we're going to go around the defensive lines. We're going to outflank them. And this maneuver, the Schieffelin Plan, means that Germany is going to invade neutral Belgium. Germany had hoped that they would just get the right to pass through Belgium, and then once they pass through Belgium, then they can outflank. They've already outflanked the French, and then they'll be able to take the city of Paris and knock the French out of the war. But the problem is the Belgians are going to fight back, and as the Belgians fight back, it delays the Germans' ability to quickly advance through Belgium and get into French soil. Another problem with attacking through neutral Belgium is it's going to draw the British into the war. as we may remember from the last lesson, the British were practicing splendid isolationism. But they also had an alliance with the Belgians that guaranteed the neutrality of Belgium. And because Germany violated Belgium, now the British had a cause to go to war against Germany. The neutrality of Belgium had been violated by the Germans, so therefore the British had to honor their century-old alliance, the century-old agreement with Belgium that meant that if you get invaded, we will defend your neutrality. So now the British Expeditionary Forces will show up on the continent, and they too will slow the Germans down. So the whole point of the Schieffelin Plan was to quickly outflank the French, get to Paris, knock them out of the war, then turn their attention on Russia. But because the Belgians resist, because the British are drawn into the war through the neutrality pact with neutrality agreement with the British, now the Germans have been delayed. So the Germans do still advance just outside of Paris, and they begin to encircle Paris. But it's at the Marne River that the French will achieve a great victory and begin to push the Germans back. This means the Schieffelin Plan has failed. The Germans were close to victory on the Western Front for sure, but now the Schieffelin Plan has failed, and now the Germans find themselves fighting on two fronts. So the British and Germans try to now cut each other off from supplies. The British are trying to cut the Germans off from their German supplies and now envelop or encircle the Germans that are in France, and the Germans are trying to entrap the British forces that are there as well. So there's a race to the sea where both sides are trying to beat the other back to the English Channel. And French Plan 17 will fail, and they'll fall back to original positions. And when they fall back to original positions, now they dig in. And they dig in to wait for, reinforcements and supplies. The Germans are waiting for a victory on the Eastern Front. And this stalemate is the nature of the Western Front. A very defensive war, a war of attrition based upon a system of trenches. And again, they had to build the trenches because of the mechanization and automation of warfare that, due to the advancements based upon the industrialization of this era, weapons were much more deadly, so the soldiers needed somewhere to duck and cover. So it's a trench warfare as well. Another way to measure World War I is to look at the costs associated with the war. And here we're looking at the human costs associated with the war. The deaths and the percentage of deaths based upon the population. And you can see the French, they lose 3.4% of their population. And Serbia loses 5.7% of their population. Whereas when you look at the Axis side, the Central Powers, we have Turkey losing 3.7% of their population. We have Germany losing 3% of their population. So in total, we have more than 9 million soldiers die as a result of the war. Another way to measure the cost of the war is the financial cost, the economic impact of the war. Decline in working population as people will be pulled from industry and put into battle. The loss of the GDP unless war takes place in another country, right? So you have a GDP that will be disrupted. The economy is disrupted because of the war, especially the economy of places like France. But at the same time, it also creates employment because soldiers have jobs and those supplying the soldiers have jobs. Yes, it damages buildings and infrastructure and raises national debt to pay for the war and causes some inflation, but there's also new innovations and new technology that will be created through the war. Another way to really evaluate the cost of the war is the psychological cost. The psychological cost, the impact it has on the psyche of those who fought in it or witnessed it. And there's an opportunity cost that we lose for the better part of it, 4.5 years of our creative geniuses are focused on warfare and not focused on, curing polio or something like that. So another way to look at the cost of the war. Economic costs, U.S. world's leading economic power. Britain's leadership as world economy will be surpassed. France will be left in ruins. Germany will be politically unstable and will suffer severe inflation as a result of the war. Russia will be cut off from the world economy because it quits the war. It abandons its allies. There's going to be instability around the world. But there is some new hope. The 19th Amendment in the United States is a consequence of the war. That is the granting of political liberty to women, having the right to vote. There'll be new medical advances like skin grafts and surgeries, and African Americans. There'll be a new sense of growing equality in America. So definitely lots of advancements as well. As they say, war is the mother of invention. And here's a photo that is simple but very effective in describing the cost of war. These four mothers gave to their country 28 brave sons who may not be coming back, right? I believe that all 28 died, and that's why they're on parade. So that's the cost of the war. For the colony of Newfoundland, there wasn't a family in Newfoundland that didn't lose somebody at the Battle of the Somme. That's the cost of the war, the impact of World War I. So that's our first outcome, is the impact of World War I. Here's a number, dollar value. It's always hard to measure something in dollars when we're talking about human lives, but they do have some numbers attached to it as well. Cost in dollars in 1914 to 18. So you can see that at that time, $125 billion were directed to the war effort. So in the end, another way of saying it, now they're saying 186.3 billion, a little bit higher number than what we saw up above. 37 million casualties when you include people that are wounded. 7.7 million people suffered the psychological trauma of being a prisoner of war. Another way of looking at it is the number of men and women that were mobilized to fight in the war. 42.9 million allies against 25.2 million Central Powers. 57% of men mobilized in World War I who died. It's an alarming number. Many allies at the end of the war faced nations in ruins and had amassed crippling debt, mostly owed to the United States. So our first outcome was to look at the nature of World War I, and I believe we've just covered that.